In this slideshow, I want to quickly look at the different types of coasts that occur on the edges of continents. We basically have two main types. Erosional coasts, which are coasts characterized by erosion, occur along active continental boundaries. You might remember that an active continental margin is the edge of a continent that also coincides with a plate boundary. So in North America, that would be the boundary here with Alaska, and all the way along the western margin of North America here, we have things like the San Andreas Fault, the Cascade Mountains, and all of this coast then is an erosional coast. We generally tend to have mountains very close to the shore, and those mountains are undergoing erosion. The shore itself is actually undergoing uplift, and that causes relatively little sediment to accumulate, and we end up usually with a relatively high energy coastline for which erosion is the dominant process. This is what it looks like in cross-section. Again, we have mountains here close to the shore. We have a relatively small continental shelf, which is the edge of the continent that is underwater. And not too far offshore, we have a steep continental shelf, which is actually where a lot of the sediment that accumulates offshore, or that is delivered to the offshore region, ends up being deposited down here at the base of the continental shelf. You end up with all kinds of interesting and cool features along erosional coasts, such as coves and sea stacks and all these really cool names. But the main point here is that all of these things are erosional, not depositional features. All of these things are due to erosion. For example, here we have we can see that erosion taking place. We have uplift, we have steep cliffs that are being pounded by relatively high energy waves. We form things like sea stacks, which are these gorgeous humps of rock in the sea. We form cliffs and arches. This is quite impressive, isn't it? This little arch over here, and there's another sea stack, and these incredible cliffs along this eroding coastline. Here's another sea cliff. This is just gigantic. In fact, if you look carefully, you'll see there's actually a person right up here to give you a scale here. There's that person way over there. So it's just a gigantic sea cliff, and when you see these, that means that this is an erosional coast where the land is being uplifted rapidly, producing these kinds of features. Now, the other type of coastline is called a depositional coast, and these tend to form along passive margins. So if you just look at this photo, you notice how different it is. Notably, there aren't any mountains here. These are generally these are coastlines along gentle terrain far from the mountains. Passive continental margins, you might remember, are the edges of a continent that don't coincide with a plate boundary. So in this case, it would be the entire eastern margin of North America and the entire Gulf Coast. Remember, the nearest plate boundary is way out here in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, the mid-Atlantic ridge. So the eastern margin of North America is actually in the middle of a plate. And so there is no active uplift, there are no active mountains, so we just have a passive margin, and these types of coasts tend to have a lot of sediment and tend to be characterized in general by the deposition and accumulation and movement of that sediment. Here we have a cross section. We can see a very wide continental shelf here now. That's the submerged edge of the continent, and this is our passive margin depositional type of shoreline. We see a bunch of features as well along these types of coasts, some of which you'll learn about in more detail, such as barrier islands and lagoons. But again, the main point here is that all of these features here are now depositional features, not erosional features. All of these features formed by the accumulation of sand, not the removal of material like would be seen along an erosional coast. Importantly, not all sandy coasts are depositional, meaning that a lot of the coasts along the passive margin of North America actually are actively eroding. So what's going on here? There's a lot of sediment here all along these passive margin coasts here, North America here, the Gulf Coast and the eastern margin of North America, but yet many of these coastlines are actively eroding. The areas in red are actively eroding. So you can see how many of these coastlines, especially, for example, the southern coastline of Louisiana, is very actively eroding, even though these coasts are characterized by an abundance of sediment. Now, there are a couple of things going on. here, and we make a distinction between, on these sandy types of coasts, or these sediment-rich coasts, we make a distinction between accreting and eroding beaches. Eroding is just what it says. The sand is being moved away. Accreting is the opposite. These are beaches where sand is accumulating along one of these sediment-rich shorelines. Now here's one indicator of what is actually going on. Here's a beach in North Carolina called Masonsboro Beach, and it's color-coded as to whether or not the beaches are accreting or eroding. The beaches in blue are accreting, and the beaches in red are eroding. And you can see what's going on is basically there's just a transfer of sand from one part of the coastline to another. So even though these areas here are eroding, they are feeding beaches out here which are accreting. And similarly, the sand over here is eroding and ending up being deposited over here, which are accreting. So there's not really any net loss of sand from the whole coastline. It's just being rearranged into different places. Here's another example of rearranging the sand. This is a barrier island, which you'll learn about later. It's called Dauphin Island in Alabama. And here what you can see happening is that erosion is occurring on the front of the island. This is the part near the Gulf of Mexico here. And sand is accumulating on the back of the island. So there's a net transfer of sand from the front of the island to the back of the island. Once again, there's still a lot of sand here. It's just that it's being repositioned and moved around by processes that we're going to talk about in this section. Now I want to make a quick note about the processes of erosion, which, remember, happen both along emergent eroding coasts as well as along sandy coasts that are actually undergoing erosion. The basic idea is along a coast, the process of erosion starts at the base of the cliffs. So as wave action sort of cuts into the shoreline, it creates a cliff. And at the base of this cliff, wave action carves out material. When that material, here we can see it, oops, that shouldn't have been there. That's okay. What you can see it here really well. This is Fort DeSoto Beach in Pinellas County. So what's going on? Let me try a different color here so you can see what's going on. So wave action has carved out all this sand here. And once you've sort of steepened this little sandy cliff here, then you will get what's called mass wasting, or this sand here will just tumble down under the influence of gravity. And by that process, this sandy beach here is actually undergoing erosion. Now there's one more really important point I want to make about eroding beaches or eroding coasts, and that is that the process of erosion is very much episodic. That is to say that for most of the time nothing much is going on at all. So most of the year the beach sort of looks like this. There's sand being accumulated and sand being eroded in equal amounts, so that the beach doesn't really change. There's not any net erosion or net accretion of sand, but every once in a while, typically during storm events, this is where you get the large erosion period. So this is what might happen during an erosion event where we might have for 20 years hardly any sand being removed from this beach, and then within the period of 6 hours during a hurricane, the beach is entirely removed and the sand is moved somewhere else. So the point is that erosion is typically episodic. It's not something that happens every hour of every day. For the most part, nothing much happens every day, every hour. It's during these relatively infrequent storm events when most erosion occurs, both along erosional sandy beaches and along uplifted active margin beaches.